Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I am your host, John Jewett.
And I am your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Dreams of pizza, burgers, donuts, ice cream, cookies, on and on and on. Welcome to contest prep. At some point, food might come to mind, and also you're going to be in the post-show phase, and what is common in that phase is binge eating, eating all the junk food that you dreamed about. That's what Luke and I are going to dive in today around when this is a problem, how to even manage it, and what to really do before you even get to that point where it's hard to bring the reels back in and you take yourself away from the goal ahead, and even worse, into a binge restrictive pattern that's gets deep seated in you for long after you've been competing.
Yeah. And the tough dynamic of this is there's such a big psychological component of that post-show phase. I think a large part of it is getting the client's goal set in mind for the post-show accurate, because like every physiological need that we're trying to drive is telling us like we need more food, we need more fats, we need more carbohydrates. But when we look at the post-show phase and trying to limit that binge eating pattern, getting someone psychologically on board with understanding that it sets up the next phase, and that buy-in for me has been huge in managing that. But I do think that some of that starts even before prep begins, because there's an understanding of the depths that prep has to get to and what that may feel like before we even get to the post-show phase. Would you agree with kind of that being where a lot of it starts?
Yeah, that has to be, I think, framed up earlier on before you even get to peak week, because there's already so much to focus on in peak week.
Yep.
But with leading into that point, people start getting excited about the post-show phase and the potential of body parts they want to grow. Like it's like the grass is always greener. Like your off-season fat can't wait for peak week, or prep, and then in prep you can't wait to off-season. So I think for one, there's a shift to be focusing towards that and start reverse engineering that timeline. So that's a lot of the problem post-show is like the timeline goes away.
Yeah.
And there's just this loss of, restraint in that capacity of a impeding show date. So having that already in place, like here's the next timeline for an idea of a show we need for what your goals are. Hey, you want to improve this muscle group. This is what needs to happen. So I think starting that piece can help shift the mindset towards, we talked about it on another podcast, towards gym performance and muscle gain improvement versus like scale weight going down and, that aspect. I think too, you need to start having the conversation with addressing foods earlier on, because what happens when you get in the digging part of prep, the phone comes out
and you start watching the food porn pages and buying the grocery store items to put in the closet. And I've even seen girls make like suitcases of food to bring to the show with them.
Yeah, it's wild. Like buying every flavor of Oreo pack. Like, are you going to eat all of these? Like it can get pretty wild, and obsessive. It really does. You just get obsessive and fantasizing over the idea of what that food is going to be like, starts to really consume your mind and almost really takes you away from the focus of what needs to be is what you need to do on the daily to improve in prep. And so it needs to just start unfollowing those pages. Same thing with like your diet setup. It's the more palatable foods you have in prep, it makes you want them even more. Like when more of the sweeteners go on or the sugar-free syrups, like those high palatability foods, like, man, it triggers you to just want more. It's almost better to have a little bit more blander diet, but also a little bit more blander social media page. So where like, you can just put those accounts on restrict, man, because you start sending them back and forth to your other competitor friends and like, oh man, look at this. This looks so good. To where it's just perturbating that psychology around this is going to be so rewarding after like when I'm able to have it. And really like once you have those things, like, it's good, but the fantasy is far greater than the reality of what those are.
Yeah, I think I've done this a couple times recently, and I think it's something I'm going to start doing more, is asking questions around the things that clients like to do outside of like bodybuilding. Like what gives them that feeling of, oh, this is fun, or oh, this is almost like a dopamine hit, right? Because some of it is like that dopamine hit of like that satisfaction very early on. And almost building that into the plan as part of whether it's like something outside that can be included as activity or whatever that may be. Or if it's like an activity they stopped during prep that they want to get back to. Like I think I had one recently that was like going to the beach and doing like wakeboarding or surfing type stuff. It's like, yeah, you could go do that, enjoy yourself, not have it be food focused, and actually get kind of like that feeling of satisfaction of doing something that's different than what you've been doing for the last 20, 24 weeks, you know?
It can be hard with bodybuilding, right? Because I was talking with a friend and how he was going to go hunting, and he's like, man, I went just like half a mile and I was just totally gassed walking around. I was like, it is limiting like what we can do, and especially in prep, because it takes you away from what you need to do performance wise, training and cardio. You just don't have the energy. So some of those other hobbies that you enjoy might be taken out a little bit. Like for myself, rather than like spend my hobby time forming a Yelp, food tour which is a thing. I like cars, so I start planning out like my car build and researching and looking and doing that, like putting my mind into that, which could be productive for what I want to do and also explore more of the hobby when I'm out of prep. But that could be the same for other individuals. Some people can take a obsession and just direct it into something else, which could be negative. Like I know people that get into shopping.
Yeah.
Obsessively shopping, go like wake up in the night going through like and just buying shoes or watches or whatever it may be. So that could be problematic, but I would say, try to redirect it into something else that you're interested in. Also something that calms your mind too. Like how often do you pick up a book and just read? Renee's been doing that every night, just reading before bed, which, gosh, that seems foreign for a lot of people. We're so have to be constantly stimulated or scrolling and looking for the next food porn fix that's gonna give you that rush. So calm your mind and put it focus in a relaxing task, like something like that, or something else that you enjoy.
Yep, I 100% agree. I think part of that post-show phase too is a little bit of flexibility built into the plan and or autonomy. I really like that with the post-show plan. So something I've been doing a lot of recently as well to do that is, like, obviously the nutrition plan is back in their inbox, like the day after the show or the day kind of leading into the show, or even before they do the show, depending on the athlete. But
that's an important part, Luke, before you jump to the plan itself, because you just mentioned something about getting a plan in place in advance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What has that done around like your client's ability to know what they have to do and get back on it?
Yeah. I'm lucky in that a lot of the clients that I coach now are very, very responsible with how they manage themselves. And so I can give them that day of after, just to kind of have like flexibly eat the day after, and they're not going to go blow it. But I have some where I'll actually have the post-show plan in their inbox at the start of peak week. And a lot of that has to do with the expectations of knowing what's to come. And so they don't have this opportunity to start going down that rush of food that can really kind of start to chase them into a place that's a bad spot and lead to them binging. So a lot of times that's having a meal plan set up. And I write my meal plans in what's called a dual meal plan. So it maps all the food out to the left and then the macros of every food item to the right, so that if they want to sub some food, then they can just do that very easily. But they have that plan in place and numbers in front of them for the day after the show and know what they need to do. And then also, like, there's obviously the desire to have some family time. So there is typically a meal or two built into that first day after. And I kind of tell them with instructions how to manage that, like one entree at the dinner, adjust your food during the day according to how much you eat during those meals. And then they're typically picking up the plan that Monday after, if it's like a Saturday show.
It definitely depends on the client and their history of what if they've had issues or psychological issues managing post-show. And there's almost 3 areas that you need to be considered before getting to that point. Is, for one, what is the goal of that post-show period? Because someone might have a show 1 week later.
Yep.
And that post-show looks a lot different than someone that is going into off season or that has a show in 3 weeks. Like, the flexibility allowed within those could be very different. Then there's also going to be the response to that untracked meeting, because like even for Renee and myself, for example, like we can go out and have a great celebration meal, eat some desserts, and we can pull it right back down. And that's our response. Have other people that don't respond that quickly, and it sticks with them for like all the way to the next show to where you don't see the improvement. So there's also the response element to it. Then there has to be in mindfulness of the health, psychological health aspect to post-show. Because some people can go eat and it's like, it could be physical based. They are just hungry, but the emotional side isn't taking them to a unhealthy mental place that's feeding that binge restrict disordered pattern. Mm-hmm. This guy's go eat the large pizza, turn it off. It's no big deal. Like it wasn't driven by that. But if you eat like that and you have that binge where it's hard to stop, you have guilt afterwards. That doesn't just happen immediately post-show in one day. That's something that's been probably living inside that person for a while, and those patterns have been building up over time, and then it just comes to fruition in that post-show period. So that's the one where, considering those 3 things, the goal, the response, and also the mental side, is how we would differentiate what the post-show period would look like for someone with structuring a meal plan or flexible eating after the show.
I agree. I'm not going to lie, pretty much across the board, if there's another show, I'm back on plan the next day, like without a doubt.
Oh, yeah.
Even if it's a higher food plan, like I need a trackable data of what's the response happening to that. Now, there is cases where the shows are far enough apart where I'm like, look, go have a meal that night of the show, as long as they're kind of the response that you said, they pull back down pretty quickly to feeds, and then we're back on it the next day. But I'm not going to lie, I've had some cases where I told people like, yeah, you're going to do this first show and you're not going to get anything the night after, and you're just going to be back on plan, and that's what it is. Because it's what you signed up for. And at the end of the day, like, you need to do what's going to create the outcome that you want. And this happens a lot when you're doing a national show, like a pro qualifier as the second show or third show, because when you're dealing with that level of an athlete, and we talked about this on the peaking episode, sometimes I'm doing that first show not 100% all the way. I'm bringing an athlete to that qualifier 90, 95%, because if it's like 4 or 5 weeks away from the pro qual. And so it's just go to the show, get our qualification, and then let's move on to the national show. And there's work to be done there. So a lot of times there won't be a meal after that case.
I agree. I'm the same in that way. And it's a mindset thing too. Like, what is our real goal this season? It's like going nationals, getting a pro card. So if you didn't have to requalify, you wouldn't have even done that show to begin with. The real celebration is winning that national show, not winning the state or local show, even though it's an accomplishment, absolutely. But that was just the little stepping stone we need to get to where we really want to be. Mm-hmm. So don't let that detract you from, that main goal. And it's with post show. Yeah, I agree. A lot of times I'll have someone that could go out the night, but we have it structured. Like, a lot of times it could be a steak, like a potato, plain, and some vegetables, and that might be it. Also, what's going to be impactful is what you had to do, like manipulation wise.
Yep.
And what that person's baseline is, right? You have the guy that's, loading up on like 800 grams of carbs. It looks a lot different than the bikini girl that just need 100 grams of carbs or something, right?
Yeah.
For what they're going to be able to do post show. But also, on that that same strain is having that plan to where you're like, yeah, this is what you're going to have post show. It's already picked. Don't bring food back to your hotel room when you go out to the restaurant. The temptation is just way too strong. Have a hotel room that just has your prep food. Don't go out and buy every pack of Oreo. I'll visit all the donut and cookie stores in the area. If that's all sitting around you, the mental drive to eat those things could be far exceed what you can even control. So if it's not around, it's a lot easier to avoid the temptation. So that's at least a couple things that can help like kind of hack that type of those issues. And another thing that needs to start in the athlete development process is mindful eating. And it's the idea of not being mindless eating, and that's modern day how we culturally can really eat, is that you're eating your food, you're on your phone scrolling, and food's just going in your mouth, and you don't really recognize like the taste of the food, like hunger signaling around the food, and all of a sudden your meal's gone and it's all done. And that pattern can get ingrained to where even when you're in this binge, food's just getting slammed through and you're not recognizing, am I emotionally or actually physically hungry? What does this food taste like? What is my actual hunger level getting sustained to? So it's a point of like, hey, we need to start thinking about these things when you're post show, or even for that post show meal. Eat to a point when you feel you have some physical fullness, not uncomfortability, and that's your stop point. And you have to sit there and actually think about your food. Don't be on your phone to where you're now off just in the IG world and mindlessly continuing to eat food. So having to shift the mindset, because in prep, it's the food is what the food is. Like you're trying not to have more of it, but post show, more could go in, and you need some level of regulation that's kind of been removed in prep and untaught in a sense. So that's when it's should be starting to really ingrain. Like, we need to pay attention when you're eating your food and be engaged in the meal.
Yeah, I think it's funny now that I'm very aware of this now that I'm not competing, like the mindful eating, like sitting with my meal and eating it and like making those decisions around what I'm eating and stuff, just because it's just been on autopilot for 10 years, right? Just, it is what it is. You do it and you move on. But I think one aspect of the post show I really like to kind of dive into is autonomy in that process, and trying to give some of that back to the client, because there's been a lot of autonomy taken away from the client in the contest prep. And that is to be expected. Like, if you have expectations of that autonomy being very high in prep, you're probably in the wrong sport. But what I would say, and kind of coming back, is training is a place where I can really instill a lot of autonomy into the client kind of in that post-show phase, right? The nutrition plan structure is, pretty much what it is. You can use macros to pull foods in and out. But with the training, I'll actually let people tinker for like a week or two. I'll kind of give them a split setup and say, hey, I want you to go and do this many sets of each body part, but let's try some new movements out that you haven't done since contest prep. And as long as they're keeping it within that 1 to 2 reps in reserve that first week, potentially 1 rep in reserve week 2, that tinkering allows them to almost have fun in the gym again, because it's been so automatized with the contest prep and everything is exactly what it needs to be. And I've seen a lot of value in that for that first 2 weeks post show, because they're getting that ability to make decisions within that training process post show.
It makes it exciting again, because you lose the excitement in prep of training, because training, you like don't get a pump anymore. You're doing the same movements for, repeatability and measurability. Yeah. And it just, and some of those things you don't want, maybe you get some new equipment in the gym, you want to swap it out, but you just can't yet. So that is the time where you could have fun in training. And it also, what we were talking about earlier with shifting a mindset into, muscle gain, the next timeline, improvements, you can start having people like kind of collaborate in that process with picking exercises. Yep. So I think that does a few things with the client to have like good buy-in and adherence in the plan. And that's what a lot of this does come down to, is adherence and sustainability is like the number one thing in programming. Yeah. And if you have those two things, like people enjoy their plans more, you see more process improvement and more gains because they like what they're doing and they can stick to it. So yeah, I like that. That's a good idea.
I do have a question for you, because I've seen this really through the last year of the contest prep dictating the post-show structure some, in that the caveat being how hard someone had to dig on the back end, potentially leaving that client in a different place when it comes time for the post-show, and just kind of some comments around that, because, you know, you can prepare an athlete a lot before they prep, but there's some preps you pick up that you tell the athlete that it can happen, but that it's not going to be fun to get there. And, you know, start a prep or before prep starts, they're like, yeah, that's fine. I'll do whatever I need to do to get there.
Sure.
And then you get there and they're like a little broken, and it's kind of a place of a lot of vulnerability, and kind of how that could potentially change how you go about that post-show plan going into an all season or whatever that next phase would be once you're past all the shows.
Yeah, definitely the harder you do have to dig someone, especially that person that has never been to that place before. Also the person that's a newer competitor too, that hasn't built in all the understanding of the post-show phase, the flexibility and autonomy to be able to have more control on their own. You could really set them up to be a grenade in the post-show phase where you're leading into your peak week, cardio's still really high, food's still really low, hunger signaling's, off the chart, sleep's deranged, which makes kind of the snowball effect of you sleep poor, you want more bad food to make you feel better. Mm-hmm. And then you don't have time to really pull that off, that fatigue, or feed them up into the show much. So post-show, what are they left with? Really high hunger, high fatigue driving it more. Also lack of skills because they're newer and haven't been to that point yet to want to go fill that need and feel better, especially for someone that had any type of history of unhealthy relationships with food.
Yep.
So what it takes with like coaching is having to really gauge how much is it worth to really keep digging this individual? Like, is that extra week before the show of pulling them down in fat loss, is that going to be the game changer for them? And also setting that expectation for them as well, especially a newer competitor where it's like, maybe this is just their second show. This isn't going for the Olympia. It's not going to be money. It's not going to be the career. You have to think about what does that career might really look like for that person, being able to do this for the next 10 to 15 years, not having them ruined for the next 2 to 3 because they can't get back to like a structured eating plan that leads towards their goal. So having someone where you're like, you know what? Us keep pushing doesn't make any more sense. Let's go ahead and start feeding up into the show, instilling some of these behaviors that need to happen in the post-show phase to keep the long-term vision in mind. And that is really hard as a coach because you want to put athletes on stage that represent you, that you always bring this condition. But when you're having that mindset, you're going to leave a wake of competitors that won't be able to continue competing or that are going to build in more of these unhealthy habits. We see it all the time, especially in females that are, it's kind of neglectful coaching in a way.
Yep.
But you get to that point with a female where, and it usually is females, cardio is crazy high, food's really, really low, and you're almost out of tools, and it's slow fat loss, if not any. And you're like, how long can I keep going for? And that might be okay depending on the person for the last couple weeks, but don't go any longer. Let's push the show back. We need more time. Just take them to the show or decide that we should just, go into an off-season phase because we're just that unproductive. But it would be better to take them to stage, pull the prep that way, and then have them set up for a better post-show period. But usually that individual that has to keep digging, those are the ones that have really big problems post-show. And I've made the wrong calls myself, or especially earlier on coaching, where I think someone's okay to keep pulling down and it's not conveyed enough what the real issues were. Then I get to the post-show phase, and then that really comes about where they're like, they're up X amount of weight, like what's going on? And it's like, I just really can't control my eating. And I can't follow this plan. I'm constantly failing every day. And the mental struggle with body image is there. The mental struggle with feeling guilt around eating's there. And to manage that person, it is a challenge. And that's when you do need someone that, has a therapy role to work on the psychological aspect there, but also from a nutrition perspective. You have to just be able to really strip back and be flexible as a coach and have a plan that they can have success with.
Yep.
And so for some people, that means no counting at all, no weighing yourself on the scale. I want what they can do and have a check mark for the day that, like, I was successful. And I've had some clients where, like, hey, most people will eat protein and vegetables because, hey, we want to gain muscle still, right? They're like, oh, well, hell yeah. Okay. Well, let's at least do, 5 meals and have, like, whatever. It could be a fistful of protein. It could be a measured amount of protein.
Yeah.
And then as many veggies as you'd like, at least have that. Then anything else that comes in the plan, that's okay. But just have mindful eating. Eat to where you feel like you're full.
Yeah.
Stop there. Get the junk out of the house. Have good, healthy whole foods around you. Eat more of those. And that's your plan for now, until we're able to build in more structure. And that's almost how you have to strip it back with someone that gets into that type of pattern, to where you remove that fatigue from prep, where, like, sleep's improving, body fat's up, and they're like, don't have those cravings. And then you can get them back into more of that kind of structured routine. So that was the really long answer to the question, Luke.
That's okay. That's what we're here for, right? I think it's such an important dynamic, especially now. The longer I do this, I've been coaching since 2016. The more people I put on stage, the more I'm realizing even the people who are very results driven extremely struggle with this. And
sure,
it's something to take very seriously. And everything, I would argue, from like the 8-week out point to the kind of the post-show phase, because, I've had someone just stop prep today because they fell off plan over the weekend and they couldn't stop, and they're up 14 pounds from the low that they were at, right? And they were doing great. They were executing as the best they'd ever look. The results were there. They're on stage in, I think, like 12 days, 13 days. And it was too much, right? And so there's times where it happens in a place in an athlete you don't expect it to happen, right? And
sure,
from there, it's finding where on that spectrum of, strict plan to, just the fistfuls of protein approach that you had laid out, kind of where in that spectrum do they need to now go to get them back to a mental place that's better. And so it's not to say that you're not going to make mistakes. It's to say that when you do make a mistake, let's take a step back and try to see where we need to get that athlete back to a normal spot, because it is a very extreme sport, and being very results driven, it can crop up in places you don't expect it to.
I think when you do run into that situation where, because it's not all going to be here, Luke and I gave you the recipe to use, and it's not going to happen. Like, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
What do you do about it in that instance? And, like, the moment like that binge happens and you see it in your client, for one, it's never shaming them.
Yes. Oh my God, that's so huge.
The guilt they already feel from it is more than enough, and you actually want to start trying to remove some of that too.
Yeah.
And get them focused, like, right back on the next day. Like, this is, progress to be made moving forward from this step on.
Yep.
We do want to be a bit reflective on why that happened, though, to begin with. Mm-hmm. And there's usually an emotional trigger that happened, then the action. So these things are controllable. It's recognizing the emotion and then changing the action. So for some people, it might be like the second that happens, it's almost like you're having an addictive type tendency, right? So just like with alcoholism, mm-hmm. you reach out to your, like, sponsor right away, like, hey, these are things that I'm feeling. Reach out to your coach, like, hey, these feelings are really cropping up. Like, I am about to go eat, the whole pack Oreos.
Yeah.
I always go to Oreos. I don't know. But, just tell them, just voicing it out into the world can take some control.
Yeah.
Because usually you want to internalize it, and then you want to kind of do this hidden binge eating pattern and then kind of deal with it afterwards. So trying to reframe the action when those emotions are cropping up, because the emotions are likely still going to always be there. That's how our emotions are, but reframing how you can take actions around it and maybe diverting it to something that's more healthy and productive for you. But reach out to your coach or have someone else that can be supportive in that role for you. Now, from a coaching aspect, I guess, Luke, what would you do? I guess, is it a strike 1, 2, 3, you're out of prep, or is it just individually based of, how much you would allow that to happen? And then is there any approaches you would help to like pull them back down, or is that not how you'd go about it?
Yeah, so it is very individually based. There's two real big cases I see though. So the first one would be, someone slips up, they realize they messed up, and they just want to crack on. And with that case, like, I try not to be reactive. I just try to let them get back to baseline, let them respond, and kind of see how they come off the back end of it. Most of the time, if they didn't mess up too bad, within 4 to 5 days, they're pretty much back to where they need to be. And then there's the person where the crack was so big, it brings up the question of whether prep needs to continue. And I think how bad someone falls off starts to point me in that direction. I think it's an initial sign of how much that person was struggling. I think the worst thing you can do as a coach, and this is kind of where activity starts to come into the question mark, is react with driving someone further. So more cardio, more of a deficit, all that kind of stuff. I think getting them back in routine, whether that routine is quitting prep and going into a post-show phase and trying to get their relationship with food into a better spot, is the answer. Or if it's just getting them back to the baseline diet and getting them moving in that routine again, I think either way, reacting with more is never the answer. And I think that's kind of where you can really drive the shame further by reacting with the change, in my opinion.
Well, that just further instills like binge restrict.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Or builds in like, well, I can go eat these foods. I just need to do more cardio and diet harder the next day, when the best thing is just getting back into your normal plan. Even if that means like, ideally, if you like cut food more, did more cardio, maybe you would pull back down to that low quick. But it's the psychological aspect that really needs to be managed in that situation, even though you might have lost that week on prep. So it's that's a fine balance to really ride with someone on when you're going to keep going with them or pull it back. Yeah.
We haven't touched on fluid management post-show. I think that would be something to kind of hit on, like that fluid intake right after show and kind of what that looks like and what to expect with fluid retention as well.
Yeah. I love the unexperienced client that they go out post-show, they eat whatever. The next day, they're like, man, that burger and pizza, I'm only up a pound. Like, handled that like a champ. And then like, yeah, you just wait. Because that burger or whatever you had it hasn't even started the full digestion process. And also you haven't brought fluids back in. Usually it's the 2-3 days after that weight will really spike from a meal like that. So why does that happen? For one, well, it depends what you did during peak week, right?
Yeah.
If you had someone that was really restricting water, or they even took a diuretic, you're now seeing like all those, counter hormones, aldosterone starting to rise, angiotensin, for trying to retain sodium and keep water in the system when this person has not been drinking very much of it to begin with. And then you go out and you eat a ton of high sodium food. And so you have an environment, right, that already wants to hold on to sodium and water. You jack sodium up sky high. You haven't reintroduced that much water yet. When water comes back in, there is going to be this huge spike in body weight. And usually that's when you run into guys having like lots of edema, your ankles are swollen. Then what are you doing? Well, you're flying home. That even like
Makes it worse.
compounds it even more too. So that same negative feedback that happened for the show, it's kind of delayed. Like when you cut water, like it's not going to kick in real quick. Well, the same goes in the back end of prep. Those hormones are going to take several days to really start to regulate again and come back down to baseline. So what's really the best thing for you to do when you're seeing that big weight spike is get back to baseline of fluid and sodium and being consistent, because then you'll come back to your homeostatic norm. So the issue post-show is people, if you keep eating, it's hard because your levels will keep fluctuating. You don't want to just water restrict then. You don't want more diuretics. It's just prolonging the inevitable of getting back to a norm. So that's when, what I try to recommend right when you get off stage, especially if you water restrict, is get fluid in first. And usually that can be, at least depending on the approach, usually water, just plain water is fine. Now, I won't say that's always. It might have, something that is higher, like sodium chloride. It just depends what was going on. But water first before more food. Get hydrated. For one, that's also going to help with regulate appetite and satiety, so you might not go out and eat as much, but it's going to help limit that rebound effect of water retention that you could get by just getting hydration back up. Then the next day, right back to your normal water intake. And the problem is some people can be like full if they ate the night before and they won't have as much water in them. Get water up. Like that's priority. So getting that back up, trying to regulate sodium intake, those are all things that'll help just get you back to that balance point. And be patient and realize, because a lot of people just don't realize like that it can take several days to get back and get the water off. For some people, especially that go out and eat a lot, they like way blow over, super compensate glycogen to the point they're just bellowing full, right? And so you also have a degree of like just pulling down the glycogen level too.
Yep.
So it's not only like balancing the water level out, but also depleting a little bit of glycogen. So all that, for some people, I don't see people get back to baseline like 7 to 10 days post show in some instances.
Same. Yep.
So it's going to vary, but I think just realizing like that is the situation that could happen, and knowing that is norm in that instance, but we want to do our best to not let that occur, because especially for the enhanced bodybuilder, you could really have some serious electrolyte abnormalities, especially when you're seeing like water levels skyrocket, and you get guys that can even go like hyponatremic. They swing the opposite way and could be serious. It could be deathly. We see people die post-show from having these large electrolytes swings. So for one, not doing the crazy manipulation to begin with, but also managing your post-show period carefully. And with that large rise in water, there's also a huge rise in blood pressure. Then what do the enhanced bodybuilders do too? Well, we're adding back in gear, and that's compounds that even farther. So it's a health thing to really manage in that post-show period too, to consider. So, but big thing here, get you back to baseline, get hydrated. That'll help circumvent at least some of those issues.
Is there anything within that post-show phase you don't think we touched on in regards to managing the binge eating for a client?
Not necessarily. I think that's a good framework for a lot of those things. Nothing else really comes to mind. As far as like getting beyond the immediate few days post-show, having untracked eating, and more flexibility in plan. I think we addressed that. It just comes down to the individual and what aligns with their goals and responses and their psychology. So, I think that's it. If I like to hear from anyone, below tips that you've used to better manage your post-show period. Maybe there's some helpful ones that Luke and I didn't mention. We would like to hear them down below. So
absolutely,
leave us some comments, and everyone can maybe benefit from those too. And until next time, we will talk to you later.